The year was 1513. In the Ottoman naval base of Gallipoli, the air hung thick with the scent of salt from the Dardanelles, mingled with the sharper, scholarly smells of drying ink and aging parchment. Within the stone walls of his workshop, Admiral Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, known to history as Piri Reis, leaned over a sprawling gazelle skin. The light from a high, narrow window caught the fine dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the intricate lines he had just laid down. He was not an explorer in the vein of the Genoese captain whose captured maps now lay weighted at the corner of his table. He was a compiler, a synthesizer of knowledge, a man who believed the world could be understood if one simply gathered enough pieces of it. His great project, the Kitab-e-Bahriye, or Book of Navigation, was an ambitious attempt to create a definitive atlas of the known world. For this, he drew upon a vast library of sources. He had charts from Arab sailors, maps from Portuguese traders, fragments of ancient Greek portolans, and, most prized of all, a collection of charts that his uncle, the corsair Kemal Reis, had seized from Spanish ships in the western Mediterranean. Among these were maps said to have been drawn by Columbus himself on his voyages to the New World. Piri Reis treated these sources with a scholar's reverence and a cartographer's skepticism. He noted in the margins of his own map where sources conflicted, where coastlines were speculative, and where lands were rumored but not confirmed. He worked with meticulous care. His inks were ground from charcoal, ochre, and crushed lapis lazuli, mixed with gum arabic to a precise consistency. His hand, steady from decades of command on the deck of a ship, moved with an artist's grace. He rendered the coasts of Europe and North Africa with confident, familiar strokes. The newly revealed shores of the Americas, based on the captured charts, were drawn with a mixture of fascination and caution. He copied the notes from his sources faithfully, adding rhyming couplets in Ottoman Turkish that described the local fauna, the peoples, and the navigational hazards. This was more than a map. It was a story of the world. But it was the southern edge of the parchment that gave him pause. His sources, particularly one of the charts attributed to Columbus, depicted a landmass extending eastward from the southern tip of the American continent. It was a coastline, complete with bays, river mouths, and mountain ranges. Yet, according to all known accounts, there was nothing there but open ocean, the tempestuous waters that led to the frozen, uninhabitable south. He consulted his other maps. Most showed nothing, simply fading into the decorative border of the parchment. A few included the theoretical, perfectly circular landmass of Terra Australis Incognita, a philosophical necessity required by Aristotelian physics to balance the continents of the North. This was different. This was not a philosopher's guess. It was a coastline drawn with the same detail and confidence as the shores of Spain. He saw peninsulas that jutted out like crooked fingers and inlets that suggested deep, navigable harbors. It was specific. He held a smaller, more weathered source map, its edges frayed from its sea voyage, and traced the impossible coast with a calloused finger. He did not understand it. He had no corroborating evidence for its existence, yet his duty, as he saw it, was not to invent, but to record. If the great navigator Columbus had charted this land, who was he to erase it? He dipped his reed pen into the pot of black ink, took a breath, and began to copy the ghost continent onto his masterwork. He drew what he saw, a land of temperate appearance, free of any indication of ice or snow, a place that simply should not be. 4 years later, in 1517, Piri Reis presented his completed world map to Sultan Selim I in Cairo. The map was a marvel, a geopolitical tool of immense value. The Sultan and his viziers were captivated by the detailed rendering of the New World, a land of rumored gold and strategic importance. The map demonstrated the reach and sophistication of the Ottoman Empire, its ability to gather and synthesize global intelligence. The strange southern coastline, however, drew little comment. It was likely viewed as an interesting but unverified feature, perhaps a depiction of the mythical southern continent, or simply a cartographer's flourish. In a world still being sketched out, one more phantom coast wasn't cause for alarm or even deep curiosity. The map's practical value lay in the known, not the unknown. The map served its purpose, and was then, like so many other treasures of a sprawling empire, carefully rolled and placed into the archives of the Topkapi Palace in Constantinople. Piri Reis himself continued his illustrious naval career, but his end was ignominious. At the advanced age of 90, after a series of complex political and military failures in the Persian Gulf, he was executed in Cairo in 1553 on the order of the provincial governor. His great map, the culmination of a life's work, was forgotten. For nearly 400 years, it lay dormant in the palace library. Empires rose and fell. The age of sail gave way to the age of steam. The world Piri Reis had so carefully charted was filled in, measured, and tamed. Antarctica was discovered, a continent of ice, its true coastline buried beneath miles of frozen water. The map waited, a silent, patient contradiction. It was not until 1929 that the map was rediscovered. During the conversion of the Topkapi Palace into a museum, a German theologian named Gustav Adolf Deissmann, cataloging the library's Islamic holdings, stumbled upon the rolled parchment. He immediately recognized its historical significance. The world's academic community was electrified by the find, a Turkish map from 1513 that depicted the Americas with astonishing accuracy. But it was years later that the true anomaly began to attract attention, mostly from outside the mainstream. Researchers like Professor Charles Hapgood noted that the southern coastline bore a startling resemblance to the sub-glacial landmass of Antarctica, a continent whose frozen shores were not even sighted until 1820, and whose sub-ice topography would not be mapped until the advent of seismic sounding in the mid-20th century. Hapgood's theory, that the map was based on sources from a lost ancient maritime civilization, was dismissed by historians as speculative fantasy. The map became a curiosity, a footnote in the history of cartography, its deepest secret dismissed as coincidence. The human cost of its creation, the life of its maker, the centuries of ignored knowledge, was filed away with the object itself. It was a historical artifact, and nothing more. 400 hours. The Longyearbyen Global Seed Vault, Svalbard, Norway. The alert did not come with a siren. It arrived as a single flagged data packet on a secure server buried deep within the permafrost. The packet was routed from a university in Istanbul, where a project funded by the enigmatic Takamori Institute was conducting a new series of multispectral scans on historical documents. The target of the scan was the Piri Reis Map. The Institute's official purpose was digital preservation of cultural heritage. Its actual purpose was to hunt for patterns. Dr. Kenji Tanaka did not sleep much. He was a man who found the universe far too interesting to waste time in unconsciousness. When the alert chimed on his encrypted laptop, he was cross-referencing pulsars with Cambrian extinction events, a pet project he found relaxing. The alert was tagged with the highest priority marker: Pattern Prime. He sat up, the thin blanket falling from his shoulders. He had designed the pattern recognition algorithm himself. It was programmed to ignore all known forms of human data transmission: language, mathematics, symbols, and search for something else entirely: evidence of structured, complex information encoded in ways that were not intended for biological perception. In 10 years, it had never triggered a pattern prime. He brought up the source file. It was a layered image of the Piri Reis Map, a composite of terahertz, infrared, and ultraviolet scans. The algorithm had highlighted a section of the ink itself along the anomalous southern coastline. To the naked eye, it was just ink on vellum. Under the scan's magnification, the iron gall ink, which Piri Reis had used, was not a uniform chemical layer. Within the pigment, at a near atomic level, were structures, crystalline formations that were not random, not a natural result of the ink's chemical composition or its decay over 500 years. They were organized. They formed a repeating, non-periodic pattern, a kind of physical quasi-crystal embedded within the dried ink. It was a data storage medium that had been hiding in plain sight for half a millennium. Tanaka felt a giddy, terrifying thrill. He had spent his entire life looking for a ghost, and it had just answered him from a piece of animal skin in a Turkish museum. 2 days later, a team was assembled. The Takamori Institute moved with the quiet, unnerving efficiency of an organization with limitless funding and a singular purpose. The mission required a very specific and conflicting set of skills. First, they recruited Dr. Eris Thorne. He was the world's foremost expert on Ottoman-era cartography, and the Piri Reis Map in particular. He was a man who lived in the past, comfortable with footnotes and cross-references. He was flown from his dusty office at Oxford to a private airfield outside London, told only that a new discovery required his immediate consultation. He was skeptical, annoyed, and deeply intrigued. The second call went to Dr. Lena Petrova. A Russian-born glaciologist and geophysicist with the Alfred Wegener Institute, Petrova had spent her career mapping what lay beneath the Antarctic ice. She was a woman of formidable intellect and zero patience for speculation. Her world was composed of hard data, ice core samples, seismic reflection profiles, and ground-penetrating radar grids. She dealt in timescales of millennia and forces of planetary scale. When she was approached, she assumed it was a consulting offer related to sub-glacial drilling rights. The truth, when it was hinted at, struck her as profoundly unscientific and a waste of her time. She agreed to come only because the data Tanaka presented, the raw scans of the ink, was an anomaly she could not immediately explain, and Lena Petrova hated unexplained anomalies. They met Tanaka at the destination, the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, but they weren't staying on the main station. A specialized vehicle, a massive tracked transport called an ice crawler, took them 30 kilometers out from the pole to a secondary unlisted facility known only as Platform Erebus. It was a recent classified extension of the Ice Cube Neutrino Observatory, a series of structures built directly onto and into the ice sheet. The primary research facility was a squat, hexagonal building braced against the perpetual wind. But the real work happened below. An industrial elevator descended 1.5 miles into the ice, into a cylindrical complex drilled out of the ancient compressed snow. This was Ice Cube Sub-Level 4. The air was dry and recycled, smelling of ozone and cold metal. The walls were the ice itself, reinforced with a carbon nanotube mesh that shimmered with a faint blue light from embedded LEDs. It was a place of extreme isolation and cutting-edge science. Thorne felt a wave of claustrophobia. Petrova, in her element in the cold, scanned the equipment readouts with a critical eye. Tanaka beamed, his eyes wide with the delight of a man whose wildest dreams were coming true in the most terrifying way possible. "Welcome to the workshop," Tanaka said, his voice echoing slightly in the main laboratory. In the center of the room, on a magnetically levitated, climate-controlled table, was a perfect, full-scale facsimile of the Piri Reis Map. The original is too fragile to move, of course, But this copy is embedded with all the data from the multispectral scan. Every molecule of the ink is represented in the digital substrate. Thorne approached it cautiously. I've spent 30 years studying this map. I know every line, every annotation. What could you have possibly found that we missed? You were looking at the map, Tanaka replied, tapping a command into a nearby console. A holographic projection of the southern coastline shimmered into existence above the table. You weren't looking in it. He magnified the image until the ink line dissolved into the crystalline patterns from the scan. Dr. Thorne, this is not just a map. It is a file. Petrova crossed her arms, unimpressed. It's an interesting chemical anomaly, likely a unique crystallization process due to impurities in the water Piri Reis used to mix his ink. We can write a fascinating paper on 16th century pigment chemistry. Her skepticism was a physical force, a shield against the absurdity of the situation. Dr. Petrova, Tanaka said, his tone shifting from enthusiastic to serious. My analysis suggests the data density of this pattern is approximately 1.7 zettabytes per square centimeter. If it's just chemistry, it's the most complex chemistry in the known universe. I need you to disprove it. I need you to take this map. He gestured to the glowing hologram. And prove that this coastline is a fantasy. Compare it to the bedrock. Show me it's a coincidence. Petrova stared at him, then at the map. This was a challenge, she understood. Data versus data. She walked over to her workstation, a series of monitors already linked to the station's deep ice radar arrays and the Global Geological Survey database. Fine, she said, cracking her knuckles. Let's kill this particular ghost. The work began in the sterile humming quiet of the sub-ice laboratory. For Lena Petrova, it was a familiar rhythm. She brought up the data from Operation Ice Bridge, the most comprehensive topographical survey of the Antarctic bedrock ever conducted. It was a ghost continent of its own, a landscape of mountains and valleys buried under 2 miles of ice. She overlaid the digitized coastline from the Piri Reis Map onto the ice bridge projection. Her objective was simple: show a lack of correlation. She expected to find what all previous researchers had found: a few superficial similarities, the kind of coincidental shapes that could be explained by pareidolia, the human tendency to see patterns in randomness. She initiated a comparative topographical analysis, a program that would measure every contour, every inlet, every peak, and calculate a correlation coefficient. A score of 1 would be a perfect match. A 0 would be random noise. She expected a result around 0.2, maybe 0.3 if she was being generous. She set the parameters and let the station's quantum mainframe run the calculations. While it worked, she sipped her bitter, recycled coffee and listened to Eris Thorne murmur to himself as he examined the map's annotations, providing historical color that she found entirely irrelevant. The notes here, Thorne said, pointing to a section of the map near the impossible coast, are fascinating. Piri Reis writes, "This coast was seen from a high window by a man from Genoa. He said the sun there was warm, and the rivers teemed with fish without scales." It's always been interpreted as fanciful hearsay. A high window, perhaps the crow's nest of a ship. Or perhaps he was quoting a madman, Petrova said without looking up from her screen. The analysis was complete. A single number glowed on the central monitor. 0.997. Petrova froze. She stared at the number. It wasn't possible. A 99.7% correlation was not a coincidence. It was a fingerprint. It meant the Ottoman Admiral in 1513 had drawn a map of the Antarctic sub-glacial bedrock with near-perfect accuracy. She ran the diagnostic again, then a third time. The result was the same. Her carefully constructed, rational world began to fray at the edges. "What is it?" Tanaka asked, noticing her silence. "The correlation," she whispered, her voice tight. It's a match. She turned to face him, her expression a mixture of shock and intellectual fury. It's a near-perfect match. Explain that, Kenji. Explain how a 16th-century sailor mapped a continent under 2 miles of ice. Tanaka's grin was wide and unsettling. He didn't. He copied a map that was much, much older. Older? Thorne interjected. That's the Hapgood theory. That it's a map of Antarctica from before the ice sheet formed, from a lost civilization. No, Petrova said, a new, deeper horror dawning on her. She began frantically pulling up different data sets, cross-referencing ice core samples with paleoclimatology records. No, that's not right either. She pointed a trembling finger at her screen, where the 2 maps, Piri Reis's and the modern radar scan, were superimposed. One was outlined in red, the other in blue. For most of the coastline, the lines were perfectly aligned, but not everywhere. Look. She zoomed in on a vast mountain range deep in the continent's interior. The Gamburtsev Mountains, a range larger than the Alps, entirely buried by ice. On the modern radar map, the blue line showed their jagged peaks. On the Piri Reis map, the red line showed nothing. A flat, featureless plain. In another area, a deep sub-glacial trench, the Bentley sub-glacial trench, was shown on the Piri Reis map as a high plateau. It's not a map of the past, Petrova said, her voice barely audible. It doesn't match the pre-glacial topography. It's different. It's been edited. This isn't a historical record. She looked from Tanaka to Thorne, her scientific certainty shattered. It's a blueprint. As the weight of her words settled in the cold air, Tanaka turned to his own console. The crystalline patterns in the ink were his piece of the puzzle. For days, he had been trying to decipher their structure. Now, with Petrova's revelation, he had a key. It wasn't just a file. It was a program, a set of instructions. He fed Petrova's topographical data, the differences between the blueprint and the reality, into his decryption algorithm as a variable key. He was telling the system what the intended outcome was. The station's lights flickered. A low hum emanated from the quantum computer's containment unit. On Tanaka's main screen, the quasi-crystalline pattern unfolded. It resolved itself into a breathtakingly complex series of equations, mathematical language that described gravitational physics, geology, and energy transfer on a planetary scale. The equations began to solve themselves, and a 3-dimensional model bloomed into existence on the holographic display. It was Antarctica. But it was an Antarctica in motion. The model showed the existing bedrock, and then, overlaid in a shimmering gold light, it showed the corrected version from the Piri Reis map. The Gamburtsev Mountains dissolved. The Bentley Trench filled in. It was a time lapse of planetary engineering, but it was the next layer of the model that made them all take an involuntary step back. Beneath the bedrock, a vast network of conduits appeared, channels of pure energy flowing from the coastlines and converging on a single brilliant point of light deep beneath the former location of the Gamburtsev Range. The model depicted a machine, a terraforming engine. The model showed the conduits were active. A klaxon began to blare, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the stunned silence. A red light flashed on a panel near the elevator. Seismic event detected, a calm, synthesized voice announced. Epicenter, indeterminate. Structural integrity of sub-level 4 is nominal. Petrova scrambled back to her console, her hands flying across the keyboard. That's impossible. We're on the most stable craton on the planet. We don't have seismic events. She brought up the live feed from the surface sensors. The ice sheet was groaning. The entire 2-mile-thick mass of frozen water above them was shifting, vibrating with a low-frequency hum that matched a resonance spike coming from Tanaka's model. The containment was not a physical thing. It was a concept. The idea that this was a historical artifact, an academic puzzle. That concept had just been breached. This was not history. It was a live system, and they had just turned the key. The anomaly was no longer confined to a piece of vellum. It was in the ice, in the rock beneath them. It was waking up. "Shut it down, Kenji!" Petrova's voice was sharp, cutting through the rising hum that now seemed to emanate from the very ice around them. "Whatever you did, undo it." "I don't think I can," Tanaka said, his usual ecstatic energy replaced by a focused, feverish intensity. He was no longer a theorist. He was an operator at the controls of an unknown machine. It's not a simulation anymore. The model is interfacing with the source. When we fed it the topographical key, it interpreted it as a diagnostic request. It's pinging the network. He pointed to the holographic display, where the energy conduits pulsed in perfect sync with the seismic readings. They were in a race against an opponent whose nature they couldn't comprehend. The mission had shifted from discovery to survival. They had to understand what they had woken. Petrova, the pragmatist, took command. "If that point," she gestured to the glowing convergence in the hologram, "is the source, then we need to get a direct reading. A seismic reflection won't work. The energy output would mask any return signal. We need a passive listen. Neutrinos." She was talking about the ice cube array itself. The massive detector for which this entire facility was a support station. Its sensors, called digital optical modules, were sunk in strings deep into the ice, designed to detect the faint blue light produced when a high-energy neutrino collides with an atom. Using it to pinpoint a source deep within the Earth's crust was not its intended function. It was like using a telescope to perform microscopy. "We can't," Thorne said, his face pale. He was a historian, completely out of his depth. "That requires clearance from the station commander. We don't have the authority." "We don't have time for authority," Petrova shot back. She began retasking a sector of the DOMs, routing their data feeds to her terminal. It was a breach of every protocol, an act that could end her career. "I'm going to tell Commander Davis we're running a deep ice calibration for a gamma-ray burst follow-up. He's ex-Air Force. He won't know the difference. Kenji, I need you to filter the signal. We're looking for a coherent, patterned emission, not background cosmic noise." While Petrova engaged in a high-stakes deception, lying with practiced ease to the station commander over the comms link, Thorne returned to the map facsimile. He felt useless, a relic amidst the high technology, but the map was his domain. "The high window," he muttered, his eyes scanning the Turkish script. Piri Reis wrote that his source map came from a window, pensere. It's an odd word choice, not chart or drawing. What if it wasn't a metaphor? He looked at the holographic model, at the data flowing from an ancient piece of ink. What if the original map was a display? A screen? A chime from Tanaka's workstation cut him off. "I have it," Tanaka breathed. "Lena, look at this." On his screen was a waterfall display of neutrino detection events. Most of it was the random static of the cosmos. But coming from the direction of the Gamburtsev anomaly, there was a clear, repeating pulse. It was not biological, not geological. It was the clean, unmistakable signature of an artificial signal. "It's a response," Petrova said, her eyes wide. "It's answering us." Tanaka's fingers danced across his keyboard, his signal processing software kicking in. He isolated the pulse and began a decryption analysis. It's not language, no symbolic representation. It's mathematics, a sequence of fundamental physical constants. A list appeared on the screen. The speed of light, the Planck constant, the fine structure constant. It was a universal greeting card, a way of saying, We understand the basic principles of this reality. It's a benchmark, Petrova realized. A way to establish a common frame of reference. It's intelligent. There's more, Tanaka said, his voice dropping. It's still transmitting. There's another constant in the sequence. He frowned. One that's wrong. A new line of data appeared, labeled with the universal symbol for the gravitational constant, G. But the value next to it was not the one they knew. It was off by a factor of 0.003%, a tiny, insignificant deviation in most contexts, but for a fundamental constant of the universe, it was a profound impossibility. That's not a transmission error, Petrova stated, her blood running cold. The signal-to-noise ratio is perfect. Recalibrate the sensor. It's not the sensor, Tanaka replied, his eyes locked on the screen. Look at the wave pattern. Before he could finish, a violent lurch threw them all against the consoles. The lights in the sub-level flickered and died, replaced by the stark red glow of emergency lighting. The hum intensified into a deafening, bone-jarring groan. A spiderweb of cracks appeared on the reinforced ice wall. "What was that?" Thorne yelled over the noise. Petrova was already at her station, which was running on emergency power. "Gravitational anomaly," she announced, her voice strained with disbelief. "The surface gravimeters are going insane. The local gravitational field is fluctuating. It's warping." The impossible number on Tanaka's screen was not a message. It was a status report. The machine deep beneath them was not just signaling, it was acting. It was actively, locally, changing the force of gravity. The groaning of the ice was the sound of the continent itself, responding to a fundamental law of physics being rewritten. The immediate danger was no longer theoretical. The 2-mile-thick ice sheet above their heads was now subject to forces it had never been designed to withstand. The station, their fragile bubble of life, was being squeezed by a power that could unmake worlds. The answer they had sought had arrived, and it was a threat not just to them, but to the very fabric of reality. The red emergency lights pulsed, casting the laboratory in a hellish, rhythmic glow. The groaning of the ice was a constant physical pressure, a reminder of the 2 vertical miles of crushing weight above them. Alarms continued to blare, a chorus of technological panic. "Structural integrity at 80% and falling," Petrova shouted, her hands flying over the console, trying to make sense of the flood of incomprehensible data. "The ice is flowing around us, not like a glacier, but like a fluid. The pressure is increasing exponentially. The support mesh won't hold for long." Tanaka was staring at the holographic model, which flickered but remained stable on the backup generator. The energy conduits were now glowing with a ferocious intensity. The simulation was no longer a simulation. It was a live readout of a planetary engine spooling up. "It's starting the sequence," he said, a note of pure, unadulterated awe in his voice that terrified Thorne. "The gravitational fluctuation is the first step. It's designed to destabilize the cryosphere. It's weakening the molecular bonds of the ice on a massive scale." "It's a defroster," Petrova translated, the raw horror of the situation crystallizing into a single, terrible thought. "It's going to melt the entire Antarctic ice sheet." Thorne, clutching the edge of a console to stay upright as the floor vibrated beneath him, felt his historical perspective shatter into a million pieces. The map. The warm sun. The rivers. It wasn't a description of the past. It was the end state. The goal. "It's terraforming," he said, the word feeling alien and obscene in his mouth. "It's trying to finish the job." The implications were immediate and catastrophic. The melting of the Antarctic ice sheet would raise global sea levels by over 200 feet. Every coastal city on Earth would be submerged. The sudden influx of fresh, cold water would disrupt ocean currents, plunging the planet into a chaotic new climate state. It would be an extinction-level event, orchestrated by a machine that had been waiting patiently under the ice for eons. "Commander Davis on comms," the station's AI announced. The commander's face appeared on a monitor, grim and distorted by static. "Petrova, what in God's name is going on down there? My entire station is shaking apart. I'm ordering a full evacuation of Platform Erebus. Get your team to the elevator now." "Sir, we can't," Petrova replied, her mind racing. "This isn't a natural seismic event. We've activated something, an artificial source. We think we can stop it." "I don't care what you think you can do. That's an order, Doctor. Abandon your equipment and evacuate." The connection cut out as another violent tremor shook the facility. Petrova looked at Tanaka. "Can we stop it?" Tanaka's focus was absolute. He was no longer the eccentric believer. He was the only person on Earth who could interface with the apocalypse. "Maybe. The initial pulse we sent was a diagnostic query. The machine responded by beginning its primary function. If we can reverse the syntax of the query, we might be able to send a termination command, a shutdown protocol." He was typing furiously, lines of code and alien mathematics scrolling across his screen. "The problem is, the signal is based on its modification of the G constant. To send a counter-signal, we have to broadcast on that same frequency. We'd have to generate our own gravitational warp." "That's insane," Thorne said. "It's our only option," Petrova countered. She turned to her own console, calculating energy requirements. "The neutrino array. The transmitters have a secondary function for calibration. We can overload them, focus their entire power output into a single shaped pulse. If Kenji can modulate the pulse correctly." "It might work," Tanaka finished, "but if we do it, the feedback loop will be catastrophic for the local system. It will fry every sensor, erase every byte of data we've collected. It might even physically damage the engine itself, rendering it inert forever." The choice was laid bare. It was stark and terrible. On one hand, the single greatest discovery in human history, irrefutable proof of non-human intelligence, a machine capable of engineering planets. On the other, the survival of their own. They could let the sequence continue, gathering priceless data as their world drowned, or they could blind themselves, destroy the evidence, and save everything. A loud crack echoed from the elevator shaft, followed by the screech of tortured metal. "The elevator is compromised," the AI announced calmly. "Evacuation is no longer possible." They were trapped. "That settles it then," Petrova said, her face set like stone. She was a scientist, a person who lived to gather data, but she was also a pragmatist. The data was useless if there was no one left to analyze it. "Kenji, give me the frequency and the modulation sequence. Eris, we need to buy time. Security will be coming for us. They'll follow the commander's orders and try to shut us down manually. Bar the door." Thorne, the man of books and quiet archives, found a strength he didn't know he possessed. He dragged a heavy equipment locker in front of the laboratory's main hatch, the metal scraping loudly against the deck. He was no soldier, but he could be an obstacle. Petrova and Tanaka worked in perfect, frantic sync. She diverted all station power to the ice cube transmitters, ignoring dozens of automated warnings about critical overloads. He finalized the shutdown command, a complex wave of neutrino pulses designed to mimic the machine's own protocol, but with a terminating character. Pounding began at the, door. "Dr. Petrova, open this door immediately! That's a direct order!" a voice yelled from the other side. "Just a few more seconds," Tanaka muttered, his face illuminated by the glow of the code. "The energy curve has to be perfect, or it will interpret the signal as an attack and, well, I don't know what it would do." Thorne braced himself against the door as it began to buckle inward under the force of a plasma torch. "Whatever you're doing, do it now." "Uploading the sequence," Tanaka said. "Transmitters are at maximum charge," Petrova confirmed. "Firing on your mark." "Mark! Petrova slammed her hand down on the master control. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, every light in the facility went out, plunging them into absolute darkness. The bone-jarring hum stopped, replaced by a profound, terrifying silence. A wave of nauseating vertigo washed over them as the focused beam of the transmitter fired downward, sending a pulse of warped space-time deep into the Earth's crust. It was a silent, invisible weapon, fired at an impossible target. On the holographic display, which flickered back to life on the last dregs of capacitor power, the golden conduits of the terraforming engine flared brilliantly for a single second. Then, one by one, they winked out. The central point of light dimmed, faded, and vanished. The seismic vibrations ceased. The groaning of the ice stopped. The pressure on the station's hull receded. Silence. The only sound was their own ragged breathing in the dark. The lab door burst open, and a team of security officers in polar combat gear stormed in, weapons raised. They found the three of them, the glaciologist, the theorist, the historian, standing in the dark, surrounded by dead consoles and the lingering echo of a choice that had saved the world by erasing its greatest secret. In the months that followed, the official story was cemented. The events at Platform Erebus were classified as a catastrophic equipment failure combined with an unprecedented tectonic event, a deep craton stress fracture. The facility was declared unstable and permanently sealed. The data was declared corrupted and lost. Doctors Petrova, Tanaka, and Thorne were separated, extensively debriefed by men in featureless rooms, and forced to sign national security oaths that bound them to the official narrative for life under penalty of treason. Their careers were quietly ended, their research redirected, their lives placed under permanent, subtle surveillance. The world, saved from a threat it never knew existed, went on exactly as before. Eris Thorne returned to a life that no longer fit him. He sat in his old office at Oxford, surrounded by the familiar comfort of his books, but they felt like fiction now. He would sometimes walk down to the map room at the Bodleian Library and stare at the sanitized, modern charts of the world. He would look at the clean, white expanse of Antarctica, a continent defined by its emptiness. But he could no longer see it that way. He saw the blueprint. He saw the silent, sleeping machine beneath the ice, a piece of cosmic engineering that had been paused, not destroyed. He thought of Piri Reis, the Ottoman admiral who had died a disgraced failure, never knowing the true significance of the lines he had so faithfully copied. The world had remembered him as a cartographer, a historical curiosity. But Thorne knew the truth. Piri Reis was not a map maker. He was a scribe, the last in a long line of unknowing custodians who had passed down a single terrifying page from an alien instruction manual. He had preserved a warning, or perhaps a promise, that humanity had not been equipped to understand. The world looked the same. The sun rose, the tides turned, the nations of men continued their petty squabbles. But for Thorne, and for two others, the foundation of reality had been permanently cracked. They knew that human history was a thin, fragile veneer laid over a much older and grander story. They knew that Antarctica was not a continent. It was an abandoned construction site. And they knew that the silence from the deep south was not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a project awaiting the return of its architects. Humanity was not the master of its own house. It was merely a tenant, living on borrowed time, blissfully unaware that the landlord's plans for renovation were still on file.